Paula Dobriansky, Senior Fellow at the Belfer Center of Harvard University. Welcome to HFX 2020. Paula, your last position in government was as Under Secretary of State for Global Affairs, so you've had plenty of experience in dealing with China. I know you've written about China, you've spoken about China, and on one very specific issue, which a lot of people are talking about, but we need a bit more expertise, which I'm hoping you can provide, which is the question of the Quad, the so-called quadrilateral security dialogue between the United States, India, Japan, and Australia. Why are people so interested in the Quad these days?
Well, first of all, let me commend you, if I may, on the handbook, the China Human Rights Handbook that you have written, because I want to congratulate you. You do have the Quad mentioned in here, which is important. And the reason why I think that many are looking at this kind of an arrangement is because it's agile, because it brings countries together that might not ordinarily come together. You've mentioned the Quad members, but there's Quad Plus, which includes other countries. And what are they coming around? They're coming around the issue of China, its malign activities, politically, economically, and militarily. And there's concern about how one deals with it. And this kind of an alignment is an agile one, which enables countries to come together to target those specific areas that they care most about. Let me explain. The actual quadrilateral security dialogue came into being in 2007. It was put forward by Abe. And then it had a period of being a little bit dormant, but it came together mainly as a military forum, and would conduct what's known as the Malabar exercises. So 2017, the Trump administration placed a premium on the Indo-Pacific and the importance of the Indo-Pacific arena. With that also, as we know, came not only the kind of challenge and aberrant behavior of China, but at the same time also COVID appeared. So last March, April, you had Quad Plus that brought together not just only India, Japan, US, and Australia, but it also included New Zealand, South Korea, and Vietnam. Why? Because they wanted to exchange information about COVID and the pandemic, but more significantly, they wanted to address the economic issue, supply chains. The fact that during this period, China has used and weaponized trade. It hasn't followed the rules. It has ignored intellectual property rights. So here you have an example of a kind of expanding arrangement, but it's not only for the original regions, the military paradigm, but actually for economic reasons.
And it's interesting, isn't it, in the course of researching the China Handbook, I spoke to a lot of people in Asia. Asia being a very big place, of course, starting in India, I remember raising the whole idea of, that just for the purposes of trying to understand what people are receptive towards, there's been this idea of a global NATO. And it was almost immediately just shot down as an idea which is a relic of 20th century thinking. And one of the ideas about the Quad is that it is very flexible. There are very few bells and whistles. It's not a formal alliance, but it's a partnership between equals and somehow just seems to work. Why does it work so well?
Well, I think you actually even gave a better answer than I did because I use the word agile, which it is, but you're quite right. It does bring potentially not only democracies. I mean, Vietnam is not a democracy, but it brought Vietnam into the fold because of the economic challenges that are being confronted not only by Vietnam, but other countries throughout Asia because of China's just not following the trade rules, not following the rules. An interesting point, you mentioned some are talking about a global NATO. Actually, it had been mentioned to me by a few. Do you think that there'd be an Indo-Pacific treaty organization? And interestingly enough, when you ask those in the region this question, their answer is no, absolutely not. And take a look. You not only have the Quad, but you also have Quad Plus, as I've just described. You also have Australia recently announced that it has forged a partnership with India and Indonesia. And as we know, Australia, by the way, has a very close relationship for decades with Indonesia. And now it is establishing a closer relationship with India, and definitely because of the challenges posed to it by China. But then, by the way, there's the traditional alignment, which you do reference here in the China Handbook, and that's the trilateral one that has existed, and that's among the United States, Japan, and Australia, which is in place. And some, as you cite, was even somewhat of an inspiration for the Quad and the Quad's formation itself.
It's very interesting, isn't it? I mean, when we're looking at alliances for the 21st century, that this is something which seems to be working. I mean, it's still early days. I mean, as you say, it sort of got a renaissance in 2017, but it seems to be going very well indeed. Are there lessons that other democracies and other partnerships which are essentially helpful to democracies can learn in other parts of the world? I mean, is this sort of model, as it were, applicable elsewhere?
Yes, absolutely. But first, let me make one other point just about the unique aspect. I would say, and you really were onto this in the handbook, I think that this is going to be more the wave of the future. I think that we are going to see these agile alignments, partnerships, where countries can come together on very specific challenges, very specific goals and objectives that they want to achieve, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're aligned in all other areas. And I think that we're going to see that, and we already have seen that, because you have the Quad itself, but then Quad Plus, bringing in other countries that would not necessarily join in a military arrangement, but at the same time are very concerned particularly about what's happening economically and the fact that China has just not played fair. And they want to counter it, and they want to provide a kind of coherent and cooperative alignment that's going to make a difference. And so you're very much onto something here, because that, I think, is going to be more the wave of the future that we will see. And by the way, that's not to undermine the NATO alliance. 7 decades, back in 2019, celebrated the 70th anniversary. It's a formidable alliance and an important alliance structure. But I think you're going to see it complemented by these other kinds of arrangements that have targeted goals. As to your second question about lessons learned, and can we see this picked up in other areas? Absolutely, yes. And I think one of the most interesting regions to look at actually is the Middle East. Some may well remember there was a discussion about, should the Middle East actually follow the architecture of Europe with what was formerly known as the Security and Cooperation in Europe, and now it's OSCE. Well, now, in this case, when you look at the relationship and the groundbreaking diplomatic relationship established between Israel and the Gulf states, I think what many are going to expect next is that there are others who are going to come in. And why are they going to come in? What undergirds that relationship is the challenge posed by Iran and Iran's malign activities throughout the Middle East. And I would speculate that there will be an open door for Saudi Arabia, and maybe we might even see Saudi Arabia come through that door.
It's an interesting, one must sit back and reflect on these alliances around the world and different partnerships. And starting with, you just mentioned about the Middle East and looking at Iran. It does help if you want to create alliances and meaningful partnerships, if there's a reason for them to exist.
Yes.
I mean, frankly, if there wasn't an enemy such as Iran, we wouldn't invent it, of course, but I mean, given that it's there, that's what provides the coherence. One also looks at NATO and thinks back in the 2000s, there's all this talk about, NATO essentially just sliding into obsolescence, to quote President Trump. But by the time Vladimir Putin had shown that Abkhazia and South Ossetia in Georgia was not an exception, annexed Crimea and got into eastern Ukraine, that sense of a real enemy that had, not that we had wished it upon ourselves, but provides greater coherence, and likewise the Quad. It's very unlikely these countries would have come together if China wasn't causing so many problems around the world?
Well, a very good point, because when you look back at 2007, even then, the challenge of China and it becoming a rising threat, that is actually what galvanized the support among the four countries of Japan. At the time, Prime Minister Abe had proposed it. The United States, India, and Australia joined in. And it was around this very issue, actually, of China and what China was doing militarily, economically, and politically. And then there was that interregnum between 2007 and 2017. And what had changed, by the way, when we looked at politically the relationship that Australia then had with China, actually prevented that particular arrangement or alignment from moving forward, because it was in Australia where a closer relationship was established with China, and I think there was a concern about what kind of signal it would send to the Chinese by becoming an active member. And you may recall, Australia was then prevented from the Malabar exercises. And it only happened just recently that Australia has been reintegrated into the Malabar military exercises. So you're quite right in saying that there's a galvanizing principle and a common goal and objective that has drawn these countries together, but we've also seen ebbs and flows with it. And in particular, the Quad is an example of that.
Just as a final question to kind of round this discussion out about the Quad, but more generally these points you raise about how one needs to be galvanized to be working together. Otherwise, what's the point? Do you believe that Xi Jinping has overplayed his hand? Did he expect? I mean, authoritarian regimes often underestimate democracies because they think that all this division is a sign of weakness, but actually it's a sign of perhaps an emerging discussion and people get it right or more right than wrong in the end. Do you have that sense that, India has suddenly become very tough on China? There is the Quad. NATO has got a China policy now. The transatlantic relationship in many respects is stronger because of the concerns about China. Has Xi Jinping misinterpreted democracies and sort of thought too much about himself and his own power and forgotten that people do actually respond to aggression and assertiveness?
I would say that Xi Jinping has underestimated the kind of global reaction to the kinds of activities in all of these areas, that aggressive activities that China has pursued. And I think that China thought that economically it would have a strong suit. And I would say two of the surprises that are striking in this year. One is, by the way, you mentioned NATO. Of course, NATO came out, Stoltenberg, with a statement about how NATO would deal with China's military threat. But also, interestingly enough, the EU. The EU had its annual meeting with China, and traditionally there is a communiqué which is issued. There was no communiqué issued this year, and in fact, on the contrary, several key issues were highlighted. Hong Kong was highlighted, the cyber threat was highlighted, and also the imposition of the national security law. So here, I think it was disconcerting, especially because Europe has been a primary focus for China. And actually, I think there has been a minimization, if you will, of or marginalization to some extent of the relationship at this time, or rethinking. That's even, I think, a better way of describing it, a rethinking. The other example, by the way, that I'd like to give is also, I think that when you look at not just this year, but actually it's last year and the year before, look at what's happening economically in Asia. Did you know that South Korea already had been pulling out all of its electronic manufactured goods, Samsung, Sony, out of China and moving it into India, moving it elsewhere? Why? Because of the security threat. So even before the focal point of the Quad, you have individual countries who were taking actions themselves and then began to realize, hey, we have a common goal, a common objective here. Let's pull together, particularly with regard to these supply chains. And by the way, the same goes with Japan. It wasn't just this year, 2020. You look back and to see what Japan was doing in 2019, 2018, already pulling out manufacturing out of China. And then there's another interesting development I have to mention, and that is Vietnam. Meanwhile, Vietnam, communist country, had issued a defense paper, and in the defense paper, they specifically said they want to forge a greater collaboration with the United States. Very important. And not only did they do that, but by the way, then Secretary of Defense Esper made a trip actually last year to Vietnam, to Mongolia. And as I pointed out, Vietnam is part of the Quad Plus, and it has an opportunity to become much more of a manufacturing hub in Asia than it has been, and drawing down and drawing away from China. So yes, is Xi Jinping concerned? Yes, I would say so, because there's been political rethinking. There has also been a solidification of the military component. Now Australia's in the Malabar exercises. And then finally, the economic, which started not just recently, but where you have countries that were pulling away, actually, and pulling out of China, which is impacting them economically.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? And one must only hope that we seem to have been on the back foot for quite some time, and now it's Xi Jinping's turn to be on the back foot. Ambassador Dobriansky, thank you so much for being with us at HFX 2020.
Thank you.